Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Now, I want you to imagine something with me. Picture a single moment, just one decision on one morning in 1619, 2p4, that completely changes the course of human history. Not gradually, not over decades, but instantly. Like someone flipped a switch, and suddenly we're living in an entirely different world. That's what we're diving into today, and trust me, you're not going to believe where this story takes us. Let me set the scene for you. It's August 20th, 1619. The place? Point Comfort, Virginia, just a few miles from the struggling Jamestown colony. The morning air is thick with humidity, and there's this tension hanging over everything because, honestly, things aren't going great for these early colonists. They're barely surviving, crops are failing, people are dying, and everyone's wondering if this whole New World experiment is just going to collapse. Then, cutting through the morning mist, comes a Dutch ship called the White Lion. Now, in our timeline, i.e., the real timeline, this ship carried 20 captive Africans who would become some of the first enslaved people in what would become America. That moment, that arrival, set in motion centuries of horror, injustice, and a system that would tear apart millions of families and define American history in the darkest possible way. But here's where our story takes a completely different turn. In this alternate timeline I'm about to show you, something extraordinary happens instead. Picture the scene. The ship docks, and these 20 Africans are brought ashore. But instead of being sold into slavery, the colonial leaders make a decision that seems almost impossible given what we know about history. They're looking at these people, and something clicks. Maybe it's the influence of radical Protestant theology that's been spreading through the colony. Maybe it's pressure from London investors who are getting nervous about the colony's reputation back in England. Maybe it's just one person in that room who stands up and says, "This isn't right." Whatever the reason, they make a choice that echoes through eternity. They declare these 20 Africans to be indentured servants, with contracts that end after 7 years. And here's the crucial part. They actually enforce it. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is this even possible? How does one decision change everything? Well, let me walk you through what happens next, because it's absolutely mind-blowing. Within weeks, word of this decision starts spreading. You have to understand, communication in 1619 isn't exactly Twitter. But news like this, news that challenges everything people thought they knew about how colonies were supposed to work, that travels fast. Ship captains carry the story to other ports. Merchants write letters. Religious leaders discuss it in their sermons. By October of that same year, the story reaches the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Puritan leaders are already wrestling with questions about human dignity and God's will. Remember, these are people who came to America seeking religious freedom, fleeing persecution themselves. When they hear about Jamestown's decision, it resonates in a way that surprises everyone. In 1630, just 11 years later, Massachusetts explicitly bans lifetime bondage. Not gradually, not with exceptions. They ban it completely. But here's where it gets really crazy. The economic equations that everyone thought were set in stone? They start shifting immediately. See, tobacco farming in Virginia was becoming profitable, specifically because it relied on free labor. Take away that free labor, and suddenly plantation owners have to completely rethink how they do business. Instead of expanding plantations worked by enslaved people, they're forced to innovate. They have to figure out how to make tobacco profitable with paid workers. This pushes them toward mechanization decades earlier than in our timeline. By 1640, just 21 years after that fateful morning, Virginia has water-powered tobacco processing mills. By 1680, they're experimenting with steam power for agricultural use. Think about that for a second. Steam power, in 1680, almost a century before the Industrial Revolution as we know it, all because someone decided that human beings couldn't be property. But the changes go so much deeper than just technology. The entire social structure of colonial America starts evolving in ways that would have been unimaginable in our timeline. Without slavery creating these rigid racial hierarchies, the relationships between different groups of people develop completely differently. European indentured servants start flooding into the colonies, not just thousands, but hundreds of thousands. The headright system, which granted 50 acres to anyone who paid ship passage for workers, explodes in popularity. Ship captains are making fortunes, bringing over Irish workers fleeing poverty, Scottish Highlanders displaced by English policies, German craftsmen seeking opportunity. And here's something that'll blow your mind. African workers start coming voluntarily. Word spreads back to West Africa about these colonies where black people can work for wages, earn land, build lives for themselves. By 1650, Virginia alone hosts 90,000 indentured servants from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and yes, West Africa. People are choosing to come to America not as cargo, but as human beings seeking opportunity. The religious communities start pioneering completely different economic systems. The Moravians establish communal agriculture in Pennsylvania by 1690, where they share labor and profits equally among all members. The Quakers develop sophisticated crop rotation, mechanical plowing techniques decades before anyone in our timeline figured these things out. When you're paying workers instead of owning them, efficiency becomes crucial in ways that slavery never allowed. But perhaps the most remarkable change is what happens with Native American relations. In our timeline, slavery created this hierarchy, where white colonists saw themselves as superior to everyone else. Native Africans, Native Americans, anyone who wasn't part of their group. But without slavery establishing that framework of human hierarchy, colonists approach Native Americans differently. Instead of seeing them as obstacles to expansion or potential slaves, they see them as potential partners. The Powhatan Confederacy, which in our timeline fought bitter wars with Virginia colonists, becomes agricultural partners instead of enemies. Native Americans teach advanced corn cultivation techniques in exchange for metal tools and equal trade rights. It's not perfect, there are still conflicts over land and resources, but it's fundamentally different. There's no underlying assumption that one group of humans is naturally superior to another. By 1700, something unprecedented is happening across colonial America. You have mixed communities of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans dotting the landscape. Not segregated settlements, not trading posts, but actual integrated communities where people live and work together as equals. These communities develop hybrid cultures that blend African agricultural techniques, Native American ecological knowledge, and European technological innovations. Imagine walking through one of these settlements. You might see a blacksmith shop run by a partnership between a German metalworker and a West African who brought advanced iron-working techniques from his homeland. Next door, there's a farm where Scottish indentured servants are learning Native American companion planting methods while teaching European grain cultivation. Children are growing up speaking multiple languages, eating foods that blend culinary traditions from 3 continents, playing games that no one in our timeline ever invented because these cultures never had the chance to mix as equals. The ripple effects keep spreading. Colonial governance starts operating on completely different principles. When your economy depends on keeping workers happy and productive rather than just controlling them, you develop different political systems. Town meetings become more inclusive. Legal systems start recognizing rights for indentured servants. The concept of individual liberty expands in ways that wouldn't happen in our timeline for centuries. By 1710, less than a century after that moment at Point Comfort, colonial America is already on a trajectory that looks nothing like the history we know. The population is more diverse, the economy is more innovative, the social structures are more egalitarian, and this is all just the beginning. The colonies are developing their own identity, but it's an identity built on voluntary association rather than domination. People are choosing to be American rather than being forced into American systems. The implications for what comes next, for revolution, for westward expansion, for industrial development, for everything we think we know about American history, are staggering. Here's what gives me chills thinking about this alternative timeline. Everything that follows builds on this foundation of human dignity. Every innovation, every cultural development, Every political advancement grows from the simple recognition that no human being can own another human being. It's like watching an entirely different species of civilization evolve before our eyes, and we're just getting started. Because, if you think the changes in the 1600s are dramatic, wait until you see what happens when these colonies decide to revolt against Britain. When they write their Declaration of Independence and Constitution without slavery as their original sin. When they expand westward without the driving force of plantation agriculture. When they enter the 1800s as a nation that's never known legal human bondage. That single moment in 1619, that one decision on one morning at Point Comfort, doesn't just change American history. It changes everything. The entire trajectory of human civilization pivots on that choice, creating a world where the promise of equality isn't a contradiction, but a lived reality from day one. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? So we left off with these incredible changes rippling out from that one decision in 1619. But now I want to show you something even more fascinating, how the immediate crisis that followed actually accelerated these transformations in ways nobody could have predicted. Picture this. It's 1625, just 6 years after Point Comfort, and colonial leaders are facing what they're calling the Great Labor Crisis. Without enslaved workers, the economic foundation that everyone assumed would support colonial expansion just doesn't exist. Plantation owners are panicking. Investors back in London are demanding answers. The whole colonial project seems like it might collapse. But here's the crazy part. Instead of collapsing, it explodes in completely new directions. European indentured servants start flooding in like nothing anyone has ever seen. We're not talking about the few thousand that came in our timeline. We're talking about waves of immigration that transform the entire demographic makeup of North America. Ship after ship arrives, carrying Irish families fleeing poverty, Scottish Highlanders displaced by English land policies, German craftsmen seeking opportunity, Dutch farmers looking for better soil. The headright system, which granted 50 acres to anyone paying ship passage for workers, becomes this incredible engine of immigration. By 1650, Virginia alone hosts 90,000 indentured servants from across Europe. But here's what's really remarkable. West African workers start coming voluntarily too. Word has spread back across the Atlantic about these colonies, where black people can work for wages, earn land, and build independent lives. Imagine standing on the docks at Jamestown in 1650 and watching these ships come in. You'd see families from County Cork speaking Gaelic, German metalworkers carrying their tools, West African farmers bringing seeds for crops that Europeans have never heard of. All of them coming by choice, all of them with contracts that end, all of them with the possibility of becoming landowners themselves. The transformation happens so fast it makes your head spin. Religious communities, especially, pioneer completely different ways of organizing labor and society. The Moravians establish communal agriculture in Pennsylvania by 1690, massive collective farms where everyone shares the work and shares the profits equally. It sounds radical, but it works incredibly well because everyone has a stake in the success. The Quakers develop agricultural innovations that are decades ahead of anything in our timeline. When you're paying workers instead of owning them, efficiency becomes crucial in ways that slavery never allowed. They figure out sophisticated crop rotation systems, mechanical plowing techniques, and irrigation methods that increase productivity while reducing backbreaking labor. But the most extraordinary change, the one that gives me chills every time I think about it, is what happens with Native American relations. In our timeline, slavery created this framework, where white colonists saw themselves as naturally superior to everyone else. That hierarchy poisoned every interaction with indigenous peoples, but without slavery establishing that framework of human domination, colonists approach Native Americans as potential equals and partners. The Powhatan Confederacy, which in our timeline fought devastating wars with Virginia colonists, becomes agricultural partners instead of enemies. Think about what this means. Instead of viewing Native Americans as obstacles to expansion or potential slaves, colonists see them as people with valuable knowledge and skills. Native Americans teach advanced corn cultivation techniques, Things like companion planting, where beans fix nitrogen for corn, while squash provides ground cover. They share sophisticated ecological knowledge about forest management, seasonal hunting patterns, and sustainable farming practices. In exchange, they get access to metal tools, European livestock, and equal trade relationships. By 1700, something unprecedented is happening across colonial America. You have genuine mixed communities where Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans live and work together as equals. Not just trading relationships, not just temporary alliances, but actual integrated settlements where people build lives together. Picture walking through one of these communities. Let's say it's in what we call Pennsylvania today, but they call it New Harmony. You might see a blacksmith's shop run by a partnership between Johann, a German metalworker, and Kwame, a West African who brought advanced iron-working techniques from the Akan people. Their shop doesn't just make horseshoes and farming tools, they're experimenting with new alloys, creating more efficient plows, developing mechanical innovations that won't appear in our timeline for another century. Next door, there's a farm where Scottish indentured servants, named MacLeod and Stewart, are working alongside a Lenape family, learning Native American companion planting methods while teaching European grain cultivation. The children are growing up trilingual, playing games that blend traditions from 3 continents, eating foods that would be impossible in our segregated timeline. The cultural fusion is absolutely stunning. African polyrhythmic music meets Celtic melodies and Native American flutes, creating entirely new musical forms. Cooking traditions blend in ways that create flavors no one in our world has ever tasted. Children grow up with stories that weave together European fairy tales, African folk tales, and Native American legends into something completely new. But it's the technological innovation that really accelerates everything. When you need to compete for workers instead of controlling them, you have to make work more efficient and more appealing. By 1660, colonial workshops are developing water-powered machinery for textile production. By 1670, they're experimenting with steam power for grain milling. The pace of innovation is breathtaking. German craftsmen share precision metalworking techniques. West African farmers introduce new crops like okra, black-eyed peas, and advanced rice cultivation methods. Native Americans contribute ecological knowledge that prevents the soil depletion that plagued our timeline's plantation agriculture. Colonial governance starts operating on completely different principles too. When your economy depends on keeping workers happy and productive rather than just controlling them, you develop different political systems. Town meetings become more inclusive. Legal systems start recognizing rights for indentured servants that go far beyond anything in our timeline. By 1680, many colonies have laws guaranteeing workers the right to fair treatment, adequate food and housing, and legal representation if disputes arise. Some colonies experiment with worker councils that have input into major economic decisions. It's not perfect. There are still power imbalances, still conflicts over resources, but the fundamental assumption that all people deserve basic human dignity shapes everything. The economic implications are staggering. Without free labor subsidizing agriculture, every colony has to develop more diversified, more efficient economies. The South doesn't become this agricultural monoculture dependent on cotton and tobacco. Instead, Southern colonies develop manufacturing, shipping, and technological innovation alongside agriculture. By 1700, Charleston has textile mills powered by water wheels. Savannah has shipbuilding operations that rival anything in New England. Richmond has iron works that produce farm tools, household goods, and mechanical innovations for export back to Europe. The headright system creates this incredible engine of land distribution. Because anyone who brings workers gets land, and those workers can earn their own land after their contracts end, land ownership spreads much more widely than in our timeline. By 1700, thousands of former indentured servants from Europe and Africa own their own farms, shops, and businesses. This creates a completely different class structure. Instead of a few wealthy planters controlling vast estates worked by enslaved people, you have thousands of small landowners and entrepreneurs. The economic power is distributed much more evenly, which means political power gets distributed more evenly too. religious diversity flourishes in ways that would be impossible in our timeline. Without slavery creating rigid racial hierarchies, religious communities develop around shared beliefs rather than shared ethnicity. You have integrated Quaker meetings, mixed Methodist congregations, and new syncretic religious movements that blend Christian, African, and Native American spiritual traditions. The Moravian communities become particularly innovative. They develop communal child-rearing systems where children learn skills from multiple cultural traditions. They create libraries that preserve knowledge from Europe, Africa, and indigenous America. By 1700, some Moravian communities have literacy rates approaching 90%, unheard of anywhere in the world at that time. The impact on women's roles is remarkable too. In our timeline, slavery created this ideology where white women were put on pedestals, while black women were degraded and exploited. Without that contrast, colonial society develops different concepts of gender roles. Women in mixed communities often take on economic roles that would be unthinkable in our timeline's rigid social hierarchies. African women bring traditions of female economic independence that influence European attitudes. Native American women's traditional roles in agriculture and governance provide alternative models. By 1700, women in many colonies have property rights, business ownership rights, and political participation that won't appear in our timeline until the 19th century. The pace of westward expansion changes dramatically too. Without slavery driving the constant need for new land to exploit with free labor, expansion happens more slowly but more sustainably. Colonies develop existing territories more fully before pushing west. They establish genuine relationships with Native American tribes based on trade and cooperation rather than conquest and displacement. By 1700, the boundary between colonial settlements and Native American territories is much more fluid. Trading posts become permanent mixed communities. Intermarriage creates extended family networks that span cultural boundaries. The concept of fixed racial categories that defined our timeline simply doesn't develop the same way. The results are staggering. Colonial America by 1700 has a population that's more diverse, an economy that's more innovative, social structures that are more egalitarian, and political systems that are more inclusive than anything our timeline achieved until well into the 20th century. And this is all before they even think about independence from Britain. The foundation they're building, this foundation of voluntary association, human dignity, and cultural cooperation, AI, is about to face its biggest test. Because when these colonies decide they want to govern themselves, they're going to write documents and create institutions based on principles that were actually lived realities, not just beautiful ideals contradicted by ugly truths. The stage is set for a revolution unlike anything our world has ever seen. A revolution where all men are created equal isn't hypocrisy, it's the foundation everything else is built on. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? Now we come to the moment that gives me absolute chills every time I think about it. Picture this. It's 1776, and 13 colonies are about to declare independence from the most powerful empire in the world. But in this timeline, they're doing it without the massive moral contradiction that haunted our revolution. When Thomas Jefferson sits down to write the Declaration of Independence, he doesn't have to wrestle with the horrible irony of declaring that all men are created equal while owning other human beings. In this timeline, those words ring true from the very first moment they're written. There's no hypocrisy to paper over, no contradiction to rationalize, no compromise with evil to navigate. Think about what this means for the entire philosophical foundation of the revolution. In our timeline, the founders had to perform these incredible mental gymnastics to justify fighting for liberty while denying it to others. They had to create these elaborate theories about who counted as fully human, who deserved rights, who could be excluded from the promise of equality. But in this alternate world, none of that intellectual dishonesty is necessary. The revolution becomes this pure expression of Enlightenment ideals without any dark exceptions. When they write, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," they actually mean it applies to everyone. Here's what's fascinating. The entire character of the revolution changes as a result. The colonial resistance to British taxation isn't just about economic freedom for wealthy white men, it's about protecting the rights of this incredibly diverse society they've built over the past century and a half. When the British impose the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, it affects German craftsmen in Pennsylvania, African farmers in Virginia, Native American traders in New York, Irish merchants in Boston, all as equal participants in colonial society. The resistance movement reflects that diversity in ways our timeline's revolution never could. Picture the Boston Tea Party in this timeline. Instead of just angry white merchants dressed up as Mohawks, you have actual Mohawks working alongside German dock workers, African ship captains, and Irish longshoremen. The symbolic appropriation of our timeline becomes genuine cultural cooperation. Native Americans aren't just being impersonated, they're full participants in the resistance. The intellectual arguments for independence develop along completely different lines, too. Without slavery creating these hierarchies of human worth, colonial thinkers can fully embrace natural rights philosophy. They don't have to create exceptions or carve-outs. The logic of Enlightenment thinking can flow to its natural conclusions. John Locke's ideas about life, liberty, and property don't have to be tortured into justifying human bondage. Natural law theory doesn't have to coexist with the legal fiction that some humans are property. The philosophical foundation of the revolution is rock solid because it isn't built on contradiction. When the Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia in 1774, the delegates represent this incredibly diverse colonial society. You have Benjamin Franklin working alongside delegates of African and Native American descent. The conversations happen in multiple languages. The cultural perspectives, brought to bear on questions of governance and liberty, come from traditions spanning 3 continents. The debates are still intense, don't get me wrong. There are huge disagreements about how to structure government, how to balance different interests, how to protect minority rights. But these aren't debates about whether certain groups of people deserve basic human dignity. That question was settled back in 1619. When war finally breaks out at Lexington and Concord, the colonial forces look completely different from our timeline's Continental Army. You have integrated units where European, African, and Native American soldiers fight side by side as equals. Military leadership reflects the diversity of colonial society. Tactical knowledge comes from multiple military traditions. The war itself unfolds differently too. Native American tribes don't automatically side with the British because they haven't been systematically displaced and degraded by colonial expansion. Many choose to fight for independence alongside colonists they've lived and traded with for generations. The geographic knowledge and guerrilla warfare expertise they contribute gives the revolutionaries huge advantages. But it's when they start writing foundational documents that the real magic happens. The Declaration of Independence becomes this soaring statement of universal human rights, without any asterisks or footnotes. When Jefferson writes about the pursuit of happiness, he's describing a society where people of all backgrounds have actually been pursuing happiness together for over a century. The state constitutions written during the war reflect principles that won't appear in our timeline until the 20th century. Pennsylvania's constitution includes provisions for workers' rights. Massachusetts guarantees education for all children, regardless of background. Virginia protects religious freedom for Christian, African, and Native American spiritual traditions. Then comes 1787 and the Constitutional Convention. Oh my goodness, picture this scene. The delegates gathering in Philadelphia to design a new government represent the most diverse democratic assembly in human history up to that point. The debates aren't about whether to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, because there are no enslaved people. They're about how to balance the interests of farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers, how to protect small states from large states, how to balance federal and state authority. James Madison's Virginia Plan gets modified not because of slavery, but because of genuine disagreements about representation and economic interests. The Connecticut Compromise emerges from debates about industrial versus agricultural economies, port access versus inland development, established settlements versus frontier communities. Without the 3/5 compromise poisoning everything, representation follows pure population counts. The Senate still gives equal representation to states, but the reasons are about geographic and economic diversity rather than protecting slaveholding interests. The resulting constitution is absolutely remarkable. It includes explicit protections for workers' rights that build on century-old colonial precedents. There are mandatory education provisions because literacy and civic participation have been colonial values since the 1600s. Universal male suffrage gets established regardless of property ownership because the widespread land distribution under the headright system has created thousands of small landowners. But here's the part that absolutely blows my mind. The Constitution includes a provision that stuns even the most progressive thinkers of the time. Article 7. Section 3 establishes a pathway to female suffrage within 50 years. The logic is inescapable. If you truly believe all people are created equal, if you've built a society based on voluntary association and human dignity, how do you justify excluding half the population from political participation? The debate is intense. Some delegates argue it's too radical, too fast, but others point out that women in many colonial communities have been participating in economic and civic life for decades. African women brought traditions of female leadership. Native American women have always had political roles. European women have been running businesses and farms. The exclusion of women from political participation starts to look as arbitrary and unjust as any other form of discrimination. The compromise they reach is brilliant, a constitutional mechanism that will automatically extend voting rights to women in 1837, 50 years after ratification. It's not immediate, but it's guaranteed. The Constitution becomes a living document with built-in progress toward greater equality. The Bill of Rights gets expanded too. Beyond the familiar protections for speech, religion, and due process, they add guarantees for workers' rights to organize, parents' rights to educate their children in their cultural traditions, and communities' rights to maintain their distinct identities while participating in the larger democratic system. The First Amendment protects not just Christian denominations but African spiritual traditions and Native American religious practices. The idea of separation of church and state extends to creating space for multiple spiritual traditions to coexist without government interference. The economic provisions are revolutionary too. Without slavery, creating massive concentrations of wealth in the hands of plantation owners, the Constitution includes mechanisms to prevent extreme inequality. There are limits on land accumulation, requirements for profit sharing in large enterprises, and provisions for public works projects that provide employment during economic downturns. The whole federal structure reflects the factors: diversity of colonial society. Cabinet positions are designed to represent different economic sectors and cultural communities. The Supreme Court includes justices with expertise in different legal traditions. The federal bureaucracy is structured to serve a genuinely multicultural democracy. When George Washington becomes the first president, his administration looks like the diverse society he's leading. His cabinet includes Alexander Hamilton, working alongside advisors of African and Native American background. Policy decisions get informed by perspectives that span multiple cultural traditions and economic experiences. The precedents Washington sets become foundation stones for American democracy. When he steps down after 2 terms, he's not just establishing the principle of peaceful transfer of power to have. He's demonstrating that democratic leadership can work in a genuinely diverse society. The early political parties that emerge reflect this diversity too. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans aren't divided along racial lines because racial hierarchy never became the organizing principle of society. Instead, they split over genuine policy differences, ACOT, strong federal government versus states' rights, industrial development versus agricultural focus, urban interests versus rural concerns. The newspaper debates and pamphlet wars of the early republic engage with real philosophical differences without the underlying poison of racial ideology. Political discourse can focus on genuine questions of governance and policy rather than getting twisted around justifications for human bondage. By 1800, the United States has become something unprecedented in human history, a large-scale democracy that actually lives up to its founding ideals. Not perfectly, not without conflicts and contradictions, but without the fundamental moral compromise that undermined everything in our timeline. The global implications are staggering. European intellectuals and revolutionaries look at America and see proof that Enlightenment ideals can actually work in practice. The French Revolution unfolds differently because there's a successful example of democratic equality to point to. Liberal movements across Europe gain strength because American democracy isn't undermined by obvious hypocrisy. The economic model America develops, diverse, innovative, based on paid labor and widespread ownership, CAC, starts influencing global thinking about alternatives to aristocracy and peasantry. The cultural fusion happening in American cities and towns suggests new possibilities for human societies that Europeans never imagined. But we're just getting to the really exciting part, because this morally consistent foundation is about to support developments that will absolutely transform the 19th century, westward expansion without slavery's driving force, industrialization without exploitation, immigration and cultural development along completely different lines. The stage is set for an American century that looks nothing like the one we know, and everything like the one the founders actually envisioned. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? The 1800s in this alternate timeline absolutely explode with possibilities that our world never even imagined. Without slavery driving territorial expansion, without the constant threat of internal moral contradiction, America develops along lines that are both more sustainable and more innovative than anything we experienced. Let's start with the Louisiana Purchase, because this is where things get really interesting. When Napoleon approaches President Jefferson about selling the Louisiana Territory in 1803, the entire negotiation happens for completely different reasons. In our timeline, Napoleon was desperate to sell because his Caribbean slave colonies were in revolt, and he needed quick cash for European wars. But in this alternate world, Napoleon never developed those slave-based Caribbean colonies the same way. His reasons for selling are different. They're more about European politics and less about colonial economics collapsing. So when Jefferson's envoys arrive in Paris, they're negotiating from a position of genuine partnership rather than taking advantage of Napoleon's desperation. The price is higher, significantly higher, but the terms are more favorable. The purchase includes explicit protections for Native American tribes already living in the territory. There are guarantees about cultural preservation, territorial autonomy, and representation in any future state governments. Most remarkably, the treaty includes provisions for joint American-French Native American governance of certain areas, creating this unprecedented experiment in multicultural administration. When Lewis and Clark set out to explore the new territory, their core of discovery looks completely different from our timeline's expedition. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark are still leading, but their team includes African American explorers as full equals, not just York as Clark's enslaved companion. There are Native American guides who are genuine partners in the expedition, not just hired help. The discoveries they make get documented through multiple cultural lenses, creating maps and journals that capture knowledge our timeline's expedition completely missed. Picture Sacagawea, in this timeline, not just a teenage mother helping white explorers, but part of a genuinely collaborative expedition where her expertise and cultural knowledge are valued equally with European scientific training. The botanical and zoological discoveries get recorded using Native American classification systems alongside European ones. The geographic knowledge gets preserved in ways that honor indigenous understanding of the land. But here's what really gets me excited. Westward expansion happens completely differently, without slavery creating this constant pressure to acquire new territory for plantation agriculture. American expansion becomes more deliberate, more sustainable, and more cooperative. The Mexican-American War? It never happens. There's no desperate need to expand slavery into new territories because there is no slavery to expand. When American settlers move into Texas and California, they're not bringing a labor system that conflicts with Mexican law. They're coming as farmers, craftsmen, and traders who can work within existing legal and social frameworks. Instead of the violent conquest and displacement we saw in our timeline, you get this gradual, more peaceful integration of territories through negotiation, purchase, and mutual agreement. Mexican culture doesn't get erased or marginalized. It becomes part of the American cultural fusion that's been happening since 1619. The California Gold Rush still happens, but it unfolds completely differently. Without racial hierarchies determining who can stake claims and who gets excluded, the mining camps become these incredibly diverse communities, where Chinese immigrants, Mexican landowners, Native American tribes, African American miners, and European settlers work alongside each other. The environmental destruction is much less severe because diverse cultural knowledge leads to more sustainable mining practices. Native American ecological wisdom prevents some of the worst damage. Chinese engineering techniques improve efficiency while reducing waste. The wealth generated gets distributed more widely because there aren't legal barriers preventing certain groups from participating. But let's talk about what's happening back east during this period, because that's where some of the most remarkable developments are occurring. The 1800s become the century of the great American innovation explosion. Without slavery subsidizing agriculture and keeping the South economically backward, technological development spread across the entire country. By 1810, southern cities like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans have manufacturing centers that rival anything in the North. The iron works in Richmond are producing not just farm tools but mechanical innovations that get exported to Europe. The textile industry develops differently too. Instead of relying on cotton picked by enslaved workers, American textile manufacturers innovate with different fibers and production methods. They develop wool processing techniques that make American textiles competitive with British imports. They experiment with hemp, flax, and even early synthetic fibers decades before our timeline. The transportation revolution happens faster and more comprehensively. The Erie Canal still gets built, but it's followed by dozens of other canal projects that connect every major region. Steamboat development accelerates because there's more trade happening between more diverse communities. The early railroad systems get better financing because the economy is more broadly based and less dependent on a single labor system. By 1820, America has a transportation network that won't exist in our timeline until the 1850s. Goods, people, and ideas flow between regions in ways that accelerate innovation and cultural exchange. A craftsman in New Orleans can quickly get materials from Pennsylvania. A farmer in Ohio can easily sell crops in New York. An inventor in Charleston can rapidly share innovations with manufacturers in Boston. The impact on education and literacy is absolutely staggering. Remember, the Constitution included mandatory education provisions, and many state constitutions had even stronger requirements. By 1820, America has achieved near-universal literacy rates that won't appear in our timeline until the early 20th century. But it's not just basic literacy, it's multicultural education that preserves and transmits knowledge from multiple traditions. Schools teach European languages, African languages, and Native American languages. Students learn mathematics from Islamic traditions preserved by West African scholars alongside European techniques. They study history from multiple perspectives, agriculture from diverse cultural approaches, and technological skills from traditions spanning several continents. The intellectual ferment this creates is incredible. By 1830, American universities are attracting students from around the world who want to experience this unique educational environment. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton become truly international institutions decades before our timeline's universities opened their doors to diversity. New universities get founded specifically to explore multicultural approaches to knowledge. The University of New Harmony in Pennsylvania becomes famous for its innovative agriculture program that blends techniques from 4 continents. The Charleston Institute of Technology develops engineering approaches that combine European theoretical knowledge with practical insights from African and Native American traditions. But here's where things get really exciting. The 1860s bring what historians in this timeline call the Great Labor Revolution. Instead of the Civil War tearing the country apart, America experiences a massive but ultimately peaceful transformation of worker rights and economic organization. It starts in 1863 when industrial workers in northern factories and agricultural workers across the country unite to demand better working conditions, shorter hours, and profit-sharing arrangements. This isn't a racial conflict because there's no slavery to fight over. This is a class conflict between workers and owners that cuts across all cultural and ethnic lines. The strike begins in the textile mills of Massachusetts, but spreads rapidly to shipyards in Maine, ironworks in Pennsylvania, farms in Virginia, and workshops in Ohio. For 3 months, virtually the entire American economy shuts down as workers demand fundamental changes in how capitalism operates. The remarkable thing is how peaceful it remains. Without racial tensions inflaming everything, the conflict stays focused on economic issues. Workers of European, African, and Native American backgrounds stand together. Owners find themselves negotiating with unified labor organizations that represent the entire workforce. The resolution comes through the Labor Rights Amendment, TAT, the 15th Amendment in this timeline, TAT, which gets ratified in 1865. It guarantees workers the right to organize, establishes 8-hour workdays as the national standard, requires profit sharing in enterprises over a certain size, and creates mechanisms for worker representation in corporate governance. The economic transformation that follows is remarkable. American industry becomes the most productive in the world, not through exploitation, but through cooperation. Workers who share in profits work harder and more innovatively. Companies that treat employees as partners rather than just labor costs develop better products and more efficient processes. Meanwhile, voluntary African immigration continues to create vibrant cultural communities along the eastern seaboard. The relationship with Liberia, ATA, which in this timeline becomes the Republic of Maryland, Africa, the first successful African democracy, ECA, includes special immigration agreements that bring teachers, craftsmen, traders, and intellectuals to America. By 1870, American cities have Little Lagos neighborhoods in Baltimore, New Freetown districts in Charleston, and Ashanti quarters in Philadelphia. These aren't isolated enclaves, but integrated communities where African cultural traditions flourish alongside European and Native American influences. The foods, music, arts, and ideas flowing from these communities enrich American culture in ways our timeline never experienced. African mathematical concepts influence American engineering. West African agricultural techniques improve American farming. Yoruba artistic traditions inspire new American architectural styles. The political implications are enormous too. Representatives of African background get elected to Congress, not as symbols or tokens, but as genuine political leaders, representing diverse constituencies. Native American delegates participate in federal governance as equals. The concept of racial hierarchy that poisoned our timeline's politics simply doesn't exist. By 1875, America has become something unprecedented in world history, a large, diverse, economically advanced democracy where cultural differences are sources of strength rather than division. The innovation coming out of this multicultural synthesis creates technologies, social institutions, and artistic achievements that surpass anything a more homogeneous society could produce. The global implications are staggering. European powers look at America and see proof that diverse societies can be more successful than homogeneous ones. The scramble for Africa happens differently because there's a successful African diaspora community in America advocating for different relationships. Asian immigration increases because America has demonstrated that cultural diversity creates prosperity rather than conflict. But we're approaching the end of the century, and the transformations are about to accelerate even more. The industrial innovations, the cultural fusion, the democratic institutions, AT, they're all about to come together in ways that will make the 1800s look like just the warm-up for the real American century to come. The foundation is set for developments that will absolutely revolutionize how human societies organize themselves, how they innovate, how they create art and culture, and how they relate to the rest of the world. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? Now we get to the part that absolutely blows my mind. How industrial development unfolds when it's built on cooperation instead of exploitation. The late 1800s in this timeline become this incredible period of innovation that makes our Gilded Age look primitive by comparison. Let me paint you a picture of what's happening. Without free labor subsidizing agriculture in the south, that entire region industrializes simultaneously with the north. There's no economic incentive to keep the south as this backward agricultural colony. Instead, southern cities compete with northern ones to attract investment, skilled workers, and new technologies. By 1870, Birmingham, Alabama, is rivaling Pittsburgh in steel production. But here's the remarkable part. It's doing it with completely different labor relations. The steel mills in Birmingham are cooperatively owned by their workers under the profit-sharing arrangements established by the Labor Rights Amendment. The workers aren't just employees, they're stakeholders who share in both the risks and the rewards. Atlanta becomes this major railroad hub, not through destruction and rebuilding after a civil war, but through organic growth as a transportation center, connecting diverse economic regions. The railroads themselves are engineering marvels because they're designed by teams that include European engineering knowledge, African metallurgical expertise, and Native American geographical understanding. The cotton gin gets reinvented for paid workers, and the results are fascinating. Instead of a simple machine designed to extract maximum output from enslaved labor, inventors create sophisticated devices that include safety features, efficiency mechanisms, and even early automation that reduces the physical demands on workers. It looks more like modern industrial machinery than the crude devices of our timeline, but it's the cross-cultural innovation that really accelerates everything. Picture the workshops and laboratories where these inventions happen. You have German precision manufacturing techniques being combined with West African metallurgy and Native American ecological knowledge. The results are technologies that surpass anything achieved by more homogeneous industrial societies. In 1879, something extraordinary happens in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Thomas Edison is working on perfecting the incandescent light bulb, but he's not working alone. His laboratory partner is Oluwaseun Adeyemi, an African immigrant whose grandfather was a master metalworker among the Yoruba people. Adeyemi brings crucial insights about filament materials and electrical conductivity that come from centuries of African ironworking traditions. When they finally perfect the light bulb in 1879, it's not just Edison's individual genius, it's the product of cultural knowledge exchange that wouldn't have been possible in our segregated timeline. The Edison-Adeyemi partnership becomes the model for industrial innovation across America. In Pittsburgh, Scottish steelworking expertise combines with Cherokee geological knowledge to develop new alloy techniques. In Detroit, German mechanical engineering merges with African woodworking traditions to create more efficient production methods. The automobile industry develops along completely different lines, too. When Henry Ford starts developing assembly line production, he's not dealing with desperate workers who have no choice but to accept horrible conditions. He's negotiating with organized labor from day one, creating assembly lines that are more humane, more efficient, and actually more productive than the brutal systems of our timeline. Ford's factories become showcases of cooperative industrial production. Workers help design the assembly processes, contributing knowledge from their diverse cultural backgrounds. African workers bring insights about rhythm and coordination from traditional collective work. Native American workers contribute understanding of tool design and ergonomics. European workers share precision manufacturing techniques. The result is automobiles that are higher quality, lower cost, and produced under working conditions that actually improve workers' lives rather than destroying them. By 1900, American automobile production surpasses European output not through exploitation but through innovation. The labor movement that started in the 1860s continues evolving too. Instead of the violent confrontations between workers and owners that characterized our timeline's Gilded Age, you have collaborative negotiations that benefit everyone. The worst robber baron excesses simply can't happen because workers have constitutional rights to organize and share in profits. When Andrew Carnegie builds his steel empire, he's doing it with worker partners who have legal rights to participate in major business decisions. The Carnegie Steel Company becomes a model of cooperative capitalism, where efficiency comes from engaging workers' intelligence and creativity rather than just extracting their labor. J. P. Morgan's financial innovations have to account for this new economic reality too. When he organizes corporate mergers and industrial consolidations, he's creating structures that balance investor interests with worker rights and community needs. The pure financial capitalism of our timeline gets tempered by legal requirements to consider multiple stakeholders. By 1900, America leads the world in both industrial output and worker satisfaction. Factory workers in Pennsylvania earn higher wages, work shorter hours, and have better working conditions than industrial workers anywhere else in the world. Agricultural workers in the South own their own land, use advanced machinery, and participate in cooperative marketing arrangements that give them fair prices for their crops. The technological innovations keep accelerating too. The electrical industry develops faster because Edison's multicultural approach to innovation gets copied by other inventors. Nikola Tesla arrives in America and finds a scientific community that's more open to his unconventional ideas because diversity of thought has become an accepted principle of American innovation. Tesla's alternating current system gets developed through collaboration with scientists from multiple cultural backgrounds. African scholars contribute mathematical insights preserved from ancient Islamic learning centers. Native American observers add understanding of natural electrical phenomena like lightning patterns. European theoretical physicists provide the mathematical framework. The result is electrical systems that are more efficient and safer than anything achieved in our timeline. The chemical industry explodes too. German immigrants bring advanced chemical knowledge, but they're working alongside African scholars who preserved sophisticated pharmaceutical traditions and Native American experts who understand complex plant chemistry. By 1890, American chemical companies are producing dyes, medicines, and industrial compounds that surpass European quality while maintaining much safer working conditions. The communications revolution accelerates beyond anything our timeline achieved. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone develops faster because he's working with diverse teams that bring different approaches to sound transmission and mechanical design. The early telephone networks spread more rapidly because cooperative ownership models make infrastructure investment more efficient. By 1895, America has telephone networks connecting not just major cities but rural communities, mining camps, and frontier settlements. The economic and social implications are enormous. Isolated communities can participate in national markets. Families can maintain connections across vast distances, and innovations can spread rapidly between regions. The railroad industry becomes this incredible showcase of multicultural engineering. The Transcontinental Railroad gets completed faster and more safely because the construction crews include workers from dozens of cultural backgrounds, each contributing specialized knowledge. Chinese workers bring advanced tunneling techniques. Irish workers contribute experience with difficult terrain. African workers add skills with heavy construction. Native American workers provide crucial geographical knowledge. Most importantly, these workers are paid equally and treated as skilled professionals rather than disposable labor. The quality of construction is higher, the safety record is better, and the costs are actually lower because efficient cooperation produces better results than exploitation. The mining industry transforms too. Without racial hierarchies determining who can own claims and who gets stuck with the most dangerous work, mining operations develop much safer and more efficient methods. Diverse cultural knowledge about geology, metallurgy, and mine safety creates techniques that reduce both environmental damage and worker casualties. The Colorado silver mines become famous for their cooperative ownership structures, where miners share in both the risks and the profits. The California gold fields, instead of being stripped bare by individual prospectors, get developed through community-owned operations that use sustainable extraction methods. Agricultural innovation accelerates beyond anything our timeline achieved. Without plantation agriculture keeping farming practices primitive, American agriculture becomes the most advanced in the world. Crop rotation techniques that combine European, African, and Native American knowledge create farming systems that increase productivity while improving soil health. The mechanical reaper gets improved through multicultural design input. African workers contribute insights about harvest timing and grain processing. Native American farmers add knowledge about soil preparation and crop storage. European engineers provide the mechanical expertise. The result is agricultural machinery that's more efficient, more durable, and easier to operate. By 1900, American farms are producing higher yields per acre than anywhere else in the world while maintaining soil fertility and reducing environmental impact. The agricultural surplus supports massive urban populations and provides exports that make America the world's leading food producer. The textile industry develops along completely different lines too. Instead of depending on cotton picked by enslaved workers, American textile manufacturers innovate with diverse fibers and production methods. They develop advanced wool processing, sophisticated linen production, and early experiments with synthetic fibers. The textile mills become showcases of humane industrial production. Workers have input into production processes, share in profits, and work in conditions that prioritize safety and efficiency. The quality of American textiles surpasses European products, while the workers who produce them enjoy higher living standards than textile workers anywhere else in the world. The shipping industry benefits enormously from this industrial transformation. American shipyards produce vessels that incorporate design knowledge from multiple maritime traditions. African shipbuilders contribute expertise in boat design for different water conditions. Native American craftsmen add knowledge about wood selection and treatment. European engineers provide advanced mechanical systems. The result is American ships that are faster, more durable, and safer than vessels produced anywhere else. American merchant marines dominate global trade routes, not through military force, but through superior technology and competitive pricing. The financial systems that develop to support this industrial growth are remarkable too. Instead of the boom and bust cycles that characterized our timeline's economy, cooperative ownership and profit sharing create more stable economic patterns. Workers who share in profits have incentives to maintain employment and continue innovation during economic downturns. Banking develops differently too. Without massive concentrations of wealth in the hands of plantation owners, financial power gets distributed more widely. Community banks, worker-owned credit unions, and cooperative investment funds provide capital for innovation while preventing the extreme financial speculation that destabilized our timeline's economy. By 1900, America has achieved something unprecedented in industrial history: massive production capacity combined with widely shared prosperity. Factory workers can afford the products they make. Farm workers own the land they cultivate. Innovation happens through cooperation rather than exploitation. The global implications are staggering. European investors flock to America not just for profits, but to study these new forms of industrial organization. The cooperative capitalism developing in America offers an alternative to both the harsh industrial exploitation of Europe and the feudal agricultural systems still dominant in much of the world. American technical expertise gets exported too, but it carries with it these new ideas about labor relations and cooperative ownership. When American engineers build railroads in South America or establish factories in Asia, they introduce management methods that benefit both investors and workers. The cultural implications of this industrial transformation are equally remarkable. Cities that in our timeline became polluted, overcrowded hellholes, instead develop as livable communities where industrial production coexists with human dignity. Pittsburgh's steel mills have worker gardens and recreational facilities. Detroit's automobile factories include educational programs and cultural centers. The combination of industrial prosperity and cultural diversity creates urban environments that are more vibrant, more innovative, and more humane than anything achieved in our timeline. American cities become magnets for immigrants not just because of economic opportunity, but because they offer the possibility of maintaining cultural identity while participating in modern industrial society. By the dawn of the 20th century, America has transformed itself into something unprecedented, an industrial powerhouse built on cooperation rather than exploitation, diversity rather than homogeneity, Innovation through inclusion rather than dominance through exclusion. The stage is set for cultural developments that will make the 20th century absolutely explosive with creativity and human achievement. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? Now we get to the part that absolutely takes my breath away, how American culture develops when it's built on celebration and collaboration instead of pain and resistance. The early 1900s become this incredible explosion of creativity that our timeline never even imagined. Let me start with music, because this is where the transformation is most obvious and most beautiful. Jazz still emerges, but it comes from a completely different place. Instead of growing out of the pain of oppression and the need to encode hidden messages of resistance, jazz develops from pure joy of cultural collaboration. Picture New Orleans in 1900. The city has been a melting pot of cultures for centuries, but in this timeline, that mixing happened as equals. African polyrhythms meet European harmonies, not in the context of enslaved people entertaining their oppressors, but in integrated communities, where musicians of all backgrounds jam together as friends and artistic equals. The resulting music is still revolutionary, still innovative, still absolutely incredible, but it's jazz born from celebration rather than sorrow. You hear the complexity of African rhythmic traditions combined with European harmonic sophistication, but you also hear influences that never made it into our timeline's music. Native American flute traditions add melodic elements. Caribbean percussion techniques contribute rhythm patterns. German brass instrument expertise creates new sound textures. By 1910, jazz is spreading from New Orleans across the country, but it's spreading through integrated communities rather than segregated venues. White and black musicians aren't just occasionally crossing racial lines, -8. They're regular collaborators, creating music that no single cultural tradition could produce alone. Listen to a recording from this alternate 1915. You hear Scott Joplin's ragtime piano combined with Irish fiddle techniques and Cherokee flute melodies. You hear Louis Armstrong's trumpet genius enhanced by German brass craftsmanship and African-American vocal traditions that developed without the trauma of slavery. The music is still deeply emotional, still tells stories of struggle and triumph, but the stories are about choosing America, building communities, maintaining connections to multiple homelands while creating something entirely new. The blues exist too, but they express different kinds of sorrow, homesickness rather than hopelessness, economic struggle rather than existential despair, love lost rather than humanity denied. The 12-bar blues structure still emerges from African musical traditions, but it develops alongside other musical forms rather than in isolation. Most remarkably, rock and roll emerges in the 1930s, decades earlier than in our timeline. When you don't have rigid cultural barriers preventing musical fusion, innovations happen faster. The electric guitar gets invented earlier because diverse communities of musicians are constantly pushing for new sounds. Amplification technology develops faster because integrated venues need to fill larger spaces with music that appeals to diverse audiences. The Harlem Renaissance becomes the American Renaissance, spreading across multiple cities as African, European, Asian, and Native American artists collaborate as equals. But it's not concentrated in one neighborhood of one city. It's happening simultaneously in Chicago's mixed communities, Philadelphia's integrated districts, Charleston's multicultural quarters, and dozens of other places where diversity creates artistic ferment. Langston Hughes is still writing poetry, but he's writing about different experiences, about choosing to be American, about building bridges between cultures, about the joy of cultural fusion, alongside the challenges of maintaining distinct identities. His poetry still has power and beauty, but it comes from celebration rather than resistance. Zora Neale Hurston is still collecting folklore and writing novels, but she's documenting stories of voluntary cultural preservation rather than survival under oppression. Her work captures the richness of African American culture as it develops in freedom, showing how traditions adapt and flourish when they're chosen rather than imposed. Visual arts explode with innovation too. African artistic traditions that were suppressed or lost in our timeline flourish and evolve in this alternate America. Yoruba sculpture techniques influence American public art. Akan textile patterns inspire new architectural designs. Native American pottery traditions merge with European ceramic techniques to create entirely new art forms. The result is American art that's more diverse, more innovative, and more beautiful than anything our timeline produced. Walk through an American city in 1920, and you see public sculptures that blend traditions from 4 continents, buildings decorated with patterns that no single culture could have created, murals that tell stories of voluntary cultural fusion rather than forced assimilation. Literature develops along completely different lines too. Instead of slave narratives documenting the horror of bondage, American literature features immigrant epics, Seven Ichi, stories of choosing America, building communities, maintaining connections to homelands while creating something new. The great American novel gets written multiple times by authors from different cultural backgrounds, each telling part of the story of how diverse peoples created a new kind of society. Frederick Douglass never exists because there's no slavery to escape from, but there are dozens of other writers telling equally powerful stories about the immigrant experience, the frontier experience, the urban experience in this multicultural democracy. Native American literature flourishes because indigenous cultures aren't being systematically destroyed. Instead of writing primarily about cultural loss and resistance, Native American authors write about cultural adaptation and growth. Their stories explore how traditional knowledge contributes to modern society, how ancient wisdom adapts to new circumstances, how indigenous perspectives enhance rather than conflict with other cultural traditions. Food culture in this timeline is absolutely astounding. Soul food still develops, but it's created by paid cooks with access to any ingredients they choose, working in restaurants that serve integrated communities. The fusion cuisine that emerges combines African cooking techniques with Native American ingredients, European spices, and Asian preparation methods. By 1920, American cuisine has become the most sophisticated and diverse in the world. You can walk down a street in any major American city and find restaurants serving fusion dishes that wouldn't be invented in our timeline until the late 20th century. African-influenced barbecue techniques combine with Native American smoking methods, European baking traditions, merge with African grain preparation. Asian stir-frying meets American agricultural abundance. The development of food processing and preservation happens differently too. When diverse cultural communities are sharing knowledge freely, innovation accelerates. Native American techniques for food preservation combine with European canning methods and African fermentation traditions to create food storage systems that are more efficient and more nutritious than anything achieved by individual cultures. Theatre and performance develop in revolutionary ways. Instead of minstrel shows mocking African Americans, American theatre features genuine cultural exchange. African dramatic traditions merge with European theatre techniques and Native American storytelling methods to create entirely new forms of performance. Broadway becomes famous not just for musical theatre, but for multicultural productions that couldn't exist anywhere else in the world. Plays feature integrated casts not as political statements, but as natural reflections of American society. The stories being told explore themes of voluntary cultural fusion, immigrant experience, and the challenges and joys of building diverse communities. Dance develops as fusion from the beginning. African movement traditions merge with European formal dance, Native American ceremonial dance, and Asian martial arts to create American dance forms that are more athletic, more expressive, and more diverse than anything single cultures produced. By 1930, American dance companies are touring Europe and Asia, introducing audiences to movement possibilities they never imagined. The physical expression that emerges from multicultural collaboration pushes the boundaries of what human bodies can do artistically. Fashion and design reflect this cultural fusion too. African textile traditions influence American clothing design. Native American beadwork and decoration techniques get incorporated into mainstream fashion. European tailoring precision combines with African color sensibilities and Native American functional design to create clothing that's both beautiful and practical. American architecture develops its own distinctive style that incorporates building techniques from multiple traditions. African knowledge about climate control gets combined with European structural engineering and Native American understanding of natural materials. The result is buildings that are more energy efficient, more beautiful, and more suited to American environments than purely European architectural styles. Sports develop differently too. Native American games like lacrosse become mainstream American sports much earlier. African games and athletic traditions get incorporated into American physical education. The competitive sports that emerge emphasize both individual excellence and team cooperation, reflecting the cultural values of this diverse society. By 1930, America has developed sporting traditions that emphasize fair play, cultural respect, and community building alongside competitive excellence. American athletes competing internationally represent not just physical prowess, but cultural values that inspire admiration rather than fear. The mass media that emerges to document and spread this cultural renaissance operates on different principles too. Newspapers and magazines in major cities are published in multiple languages, serving diverse communities while maintaining common civic dialogue. Radio programming includes music, news, and entertainment that reflects the full spectrum of American cultural diversity. Motion pictures, when they develop, tell stories that celebrate cultural diversity rather than reinforcing racial hierarchies. The early film industry creates movies that explore themes of voluntary cultural fusion, immigrant success stories, and the adventures of building diverse communities. Instead of films that marginalize or stereotype different cultural groups, American cinema becomes famous for productions that showcase the talents and perspectives of artists from all backgrounds. By 1940, American culture has become something unprecedented in human history, a fusion of traditions from multiple continents that maintains the distinctiveness of individual cultures while creating something entirely new. It's culture born from freedom rather than oppression, from choice rather than force, from celebration rather than resistance. But even as we marvel at these cultural achievements, we have to acknowledge what's missing from this timeline. The profound spiritual and artistic contributions that were born specifically from struggle and survival don't exist in the same way. And that recognition brings us to our final chapter, understanding what we've gained and lost by imagining this alternate world. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? As we reach the end of our journey through this alternate timeline, I want you to sit with something that's been building throughout our story. This alternate America, this world without slavery, achieves remarkable things. But as we celebrate these achievements, we also have to grapple with a profound question. What do we lose when we imagine away one of history's greatest injustices? Let me paint you a picture of where this alternate timeline takes us by the middle of the 20th century. America reaches the moon in 1959, 13 years earlier than our timeline managed. Why? Because diverse perspectives accelerate innovation in ways homogeneous societies never achieve. The rocket program includes African-American mathematicians like Katherine Johnson from day one, not as breakthrough exceptions, but as natural participants in American scientific excellence. Native American understanding of ballistics and trajectory, preserved and developed over centuries of voluntary cultural exchange, contributes crucial insights to spacecraft navigation. European theoretical physics combines with African metallurgy and Native American astronomy to create space technology that surpasses anything single cultures could develop. But here's what's remarkable. When Neil Armstrong and his crewmates land on the lunar surface, they're representing an America that actually lives up to its founding ideals. The words they broadcast back to Earth come from a nation that never had to overcome its original sin because it never committed that sin in the first place. The civil rights movement never needs to happen because civil rights were never denied. There's no Martin Luther King Jr. because there's no dream deferred to fight for. There's no Rosa Parks because buses were never segregated. There's no Freedom Riders because freedom was never restricted based on race. Instead, the 1960s see the global equality movement. America's example of successful multicultural democracy inspires worldwide changes. Without its own massive moral contradiction to overcome, America becomes a genuine beacon of freedom that pressures other nations to abandon their systems of oppression decades earlier than in our timeline. European colonialism in Africa starts crumbling in the 1920s because there's a successful African diaspora community in America, advocating for African independence and providing economic and political support. The scramble for Africa happens differently when there's an African American community that has political power and economic resources to influence American foreign policy. Asian immigration to America accelerates because the country has demonstrated that cultural diversity creates prosperity rather than conflict. By 1950, American cities have vibrant Chinatowns, little Tokyos, and Koreatowns that developed through invitation rather than exclusion, creating economic and cultural bridges across the Pacific that benefit everyone. The labor movement, which started in the 1860s with the Great Labor Revolution, continues evolving into forms of economic democracy that influence the entire world. By 1950, American workers have achieved levels of economic participation and workplace democracy that won't appear in our timeline until, well, they still haven't appeared in our timeline. American universities become the destination of choice for students worldwide, not just because of academic excellence, but because they offer the only genuine multicultural higher education available anywhere. The research coming out of American institutions benefits from perspectives and knowledge traditions that European universities simply don't have access to. But as I describe these achievements, I need you to understand what's missing. The transformative power that comes specifically from overcoming absolute injustice doesn't exist in this timeline. The moral courage forged in the fires of resistance to slavery never develops, because there's no slavery to resist. There's no Frederick Douglass in this alternate world, because there's no bondage to escape from. Douglass's extraordinary intelligence and eloquence might have been directed toward other achievements, but they wouldn't have been sharpened by the specific struggle against human bondage. His speeches about the meaning of freedom carry different weight when freedom was never denied. There's no Harriet Tubman because there's no Underground Railroad needed. Tubman's incredible courage and tactical genius might have found other expressions, but they wouldn't have been tested and proven in the life-or-death struggle to guide enslaved people to freedom. Her legacy as a liberator doesn't exist because there's no one who needs liberating in that particular way. There's no Sojourner Truth delivering her "Ain't I a Woman?" speech, because the specific intersection of racial and gender oppression that created the need for that speech never developed. Her powerful voice might have advocated for other causes, but it wouldn't have been forged in the particular crucible of fighting for recognition of black women's humanity. The spirituals, AT4, those incredible songs that sustained enslaved people through unimaginable suffering while encoding messages of resistance and hope, don't exist in this timeline. The musical traditions that develop are beautiful and sophisticated, but they don't carry the particular spiritual power that comes from maintaining hope in the face of absolute despair. The strength and resilience that African American families developed through centuries of survival under slavery doesn't get built in the same way. Different kinds of strength develop: the strength of successful integration, the resilience of voluntary immigration, the courage of cultural preservation in freedom, but not the specific fortitude that comes from surviving attempted dehumanization. The profound spiritual traditions that emerged from the struggle against slavery, the liberation theology, the justice-focused Christianity, the understanding of God as a God of the oppressed, to develop differently when there's no systemic oppression to struggle against. Religious life is rich and diverse, but it doesn't have the particular depth that comes from finding meaning in the midst of suffering. The literary tradition is different too. Instead of slave narratives that document the horror of bondage while asserting the fundamental humanity of the enslaved, this timeline produces immigrant stories and success narratives. They're inspiring in their own way, but they don't carry the moral weight of literature written by people who had to prove their very humanity to the world. The moral authority that comes from surviving and overcoming absolute injustice doesn't exist in the same form. America in this timeline is a successful multicultural democracy, but it hasn't been tested by the specific challenge of recognizing and correcting its own profound moral failure. Here's what I find most thought-provoking about this alternate timeline. It shows us both what slavery cost America and what the struggle against slavery gave America. The cost was enormous: centuries of wasted human potential, economic distortion, moral corruption, and social dysfunction that we're still dealing with today. But the struggle against slavery also created some of the most remarkable moral, artistic, and spiritual achievements in human history. The abolition movement developed concepts of universal human rights that influenced liberation movements worldwide. The Underground Railroad created models of resistance and community support that inspired later social movements. The spirituals and blues created musical forms that express the full range of human emotion in ways that reshape how we understand suffering and hope. The civil rights movement built on these foundations to create the most powerful non-violent resistance movement in modern history, providing models and inspiration for justice movements around the world. The leadership it produced, King, Parks, Lewis, and countless others, demonstrated forms of moral courage that continue to inspire people fighting injustice everywhere. So, what's the lesson here? It's not that suffering creates meaning, or that injustice is somehow necessary for moral development. The lesson is that human dignity and creativity persist even in the face of absolute evil, and that the struggle for justice can produce achievements that are as remarkable as the injustices that make them necessary. This alternate timeline helps us appreciate both what was lost to slavery's violence and what was gained through resistance to it. It shows us a world where America fulfilled its founding promise from the beginning, achieving remarkable prosperity and innovation through voluntary cooperation rather than forced labor. But it also helps us understand the particular moral beauty that emerges when people choose justice over injustice, when they risk everything to affirm human dignity, when they create hope in the midst of despair. That beauty exists in our timeline precisely because there was something so ugly to struggle against. The Frederick Douglass we know was shaped by slavery and slavery's aftermath, but he chose to transform that experience into wisdom, eloquence, and moral authority that continues to inspire us today. The Harriet Tubman we know faced unimaginable dangers because slavery created those dangers, but she chose to become a liberator whose courage still amazes us. The spirituals that sustain us today emerged from suffering, but they emerged because enslaved people chose to create beauty and meaning even in bondage. The civil rights movement that expanded freedom for all Americans grew out of the specific injustice of segregation, but it grew because people chose to fight for justice rather than accept oppression. Understanding this alternate timeline doesn't make me wish slavery had never happened, that's a given. But it does help me appreciate the full complexity of how historical injustices shape both the terrible costs they impose and the remarkable human responses they sometimes inspire. The America we live in today carries both the legacy of slavery's damage and the legacy of resistance to slavery. We inherit both the problems that slavery created and the solutions that the struggle against slavery developed. Both parts of that inheritance shape who we are and who we can become. As I finish this journey through an alternate timeline, I'm struck by how it illuminates the choices we face today. We can't change the past, but we can choose how we respond to its legacies. We can choose whether to build on the worst parts of our inheritance or the best parts. The alternate America I've shown you achieved remarkable things by choosing cooperation over domination, inclusion over exclusion, voluntary association over forced subjugation. Our America can still make those choices today. We can build on the tradition of resistance to injustice rather than the tradition of injustice itself. The lesson isn't that we should imagine away our history, but that we should understand it fully, both its horrors and its heroism, both its failures and its triumphs. Only by understanding what we've inherited can we choose wisely what to do with that inheritance. Thanks for taking this journey with me. I hope it's given you new ways to think about the past, the present, and the choices that shape both. Until next time, keep wondering, keep questioning, and keep imagining how things could be different, because that's how we learn to make them better. Thank you for listening to this exploration of alternate history. Remember, understanding different possibilities helps us better appreciate both what we've lost and what we've gained, and most importantly, what choices we can still make.